Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to kick off today's event and launch of the World Bank's latest report, 360-Degree Resilience, a guide to prepare the Caribbean for a new generation of shocks. I am Wesley Gibbings, and I will be your moderator and guide throughout today's event. It's well known that Caribbean countries share a unique set of development obstacles, including high vulnerability to external shocks and the challenge of multiple natural hazards. This year alone, the region endured the impacts of earthquakes, hurricanes, and volcanic activity. The COVID-19 pandemic is also with us, stirring health and socio-economic crises and claiming lives. Importantly, the Caribbean is on the front lines of the climate change crisis. COP26 made it clear we are fast running out of time. More investment and faster action to help the region adapt and to mitigate loss and damage are urgently required. There's room for hope, though. Among other things, Caribbean governments are recognizing the need to move more decisively to invest in disaster planning, with financial innovation being a key strategy. Jamaica, for instance, recently launched a catastrophe bond that will directly help the country recover more quickly against future storms without adding to the national debt. We are also witnessing more interregional and international partnerships. Some donor countries are stepping up with large commitments to develop resilient infrastructure and help regional states withstand shocks and also build capacity. Well, today's agenda proposes to address some of these issues. From the World Bank, we have Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, Felipe Jaramillo. We also have recently appointed Country Director for the Caribbean, Lilia Borunchiuk, and lead author of the report, Senior Economist Julie Rosenberg. We also have a high-power panel of experts, and I'm going to say more about them in a little while. But of course, we also want to hear from you. So feel free to send us your questions through the chat box on this facility, and the team will make sure I receive them and I will ask on your behalf. I now introduce Vice President Felipe Jaramillo to share some opening remarks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the World Bank, it is a pleasure to launch our latest report, 360-Degree Resilience, a guide to prepare the Caribbean for a new generation of shocks. It is too well known just how exposed the Caribbean region is to external shocks. Just this year, the region endured the devastating impacts of earthquakes, hurricanes, cyclones, and the threat of volcanic eruption, all of which disrupted economies and livelihoods. At the same time, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is adding more burdens affecting tourism and trade, increasing public deficits and debt, and hitting the poor and vulnerable the hardest. Governments are increasingly becoming better at preparing for natural hazards and have made investments in disaster preparedness, in disaster risk financing, and in regional collaboration mechanisms to detect and respond to incoming threats. In fact, despite recurrent losses from disasters, the Caribbean has achieved development progress and higher income levels. However, it must be said that economic growth over the past 10 years has slowed, and climate change is compounding the intensity and frequency of threats and bringing new ones, like sea level rise. The number of people exposed to floods in the region increased 70% between 2000 and 2020 and will keep increasing with climate change. 72% of infrastructure assets are exposed to at least two different types of natural hazards. And 13% of hotels along the Caribbean beaches could experience beach loss by 2050 due to sea level rise and erosion. And in some countries, the cost is huge. Annual coastal protection costs could exceed 5% of GDP every year. In this context, we really would like to insist that more efforts are needed. Now is the time to rethink prior resilience strategies and to prepare for the natural disasters of the future. New challenges need new approaches that build on strong institutions, on robust analytics, and more transparent prioritization. This report comes at an opportune time to help countries identify gaps in resilience building, and it includes policy recommendations that can help build a stronger recovery and better prepare the region for the future. Building cross-cutting resilience to disasters and climate change has been the center of the World Bank strategy in the Caribbean in recent years, and we are supporting the region with an active portfolio of over $2.8 billion in IBRD and IDA financing and trust fund financing for 74 projects. We are deepening our commitment to address climate change by increasing to 35% the share of our financing that provides climate co-benefits, designing innovative tools, such as the issuance of a catastrophe bond in Jamaica, the first in the Caribbean region, that offers financial protection against storms. Also providing policy lending support to strengthen fiscal frameworks and debt transparency. And also supporting the recovery in St. Vincent and the Grenadines with quick finance to help cover the emergency needs born from the La Soufrière volcanic eruption, and supporting SMEs and creating jobs to help the economic recovery in Haiti. Of course, more can and should be done, and the World Bank will continue to work closely with the countries and our partners in the Caribbean, providing finance, providing innovative tools, and the latest knowledge. Again, I am proud to launch this report today, and I look forward to hearing the panel's reflections and insights on how we can move the resilience agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for those insightful comments. Now I'd like to welcome Julie Rosenberg to introduce some highlights from the report. Julie?
Thank you and good morning. I hope you can all hear me and see the presentation. So I have the honor and also challenging task of presenting in 10 minutes the results of this report, which is the result of 2 years of work with a core team of 6 people, but also a larger team of sector experts from the World Bank who worked in collaboration with counterparts in countries to provide a wealth of information on resilience in the Caribbean. We also received funding from the European Union and technical support from them throughout the preparation of this project. Now, the reason why we wrote this report, is because, as you all know, the Caribbean has been suffering from many natural disasters over the past years, but it is also very exposed and vulnerable to economic shocks. And that is because countries are relatively small and they have had to specialize in a few sectors like tourism or commodity exports for which they have a comparative advantage. And while that works well in normal times, it also makes the region very vulnerable to what's happening in the rest of the world and to global economic crisis. So the region was hit very hard by the 2009 global recession and again by the COVID-19 pandemic with the collapse of tourism demand. Now, the region also has a history of bouncing back from these shocks. And overall, with the exception of Haiti, actually, all countries have reached high income level and they've reached high levels of development outcome. But now, the future of the region is more and more uncertain. And that is because climate change is bringing more intense and more frequent shocks. It's also bringing new challenges for the health sectors, for the agriculture sector. And all of this is happening in a context where tourism demand has not gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and there's high uncertainty on when and how and if tourists will come back. So we wanted to take stock of where the region was in building resilience and how prepared they were for the shocks of the future that are more uncertain and potentially more dangerous than the shocks of the past. So the report is organized in 3 parts. The first is a diagnosis, is an overview of the historical impacts of economic and natural hazards shocks in the Caribbean and the potential future impacts of climate change. And that is organized in country-specific risk profiles. Then we have a second part, which is an assessment of the progress that has been made so far in building resilience in the Caribbean. And that is presented as a traffic light system approach, where we have a list of indicators that measure progress and the gaps remaining across a wide range of different actions that countries have to take in order to build resilience. And finally, building on all the information that we got from these first 2 sections, we propose a list of recommendations. Those are broad recommendations that apply to most countries in the region, but of course not every recommendation applies to every country. Now, based on all this assessment, I will present 2 main findings and 3 main recommendations, but of course much more information can be found at the sector level and country level in the report and the background documents. The first finding is that Caribbean countries have achieved high levels of resilience, but this resilience has not always been inclusive, and a lot of people had been left behind. The reason why we're saying this is because Caribbean countries have experienced very high level of damages to their physical assets, with the 400 natural disasters that have been recorded since the 1950s. Hurricanes and other types of hazards destroy or damage the housing sector and the infrastructure sector, sometimes with Category 5 hurricanes. The value of the total assets destroyed can be as high as GDP. But despite these damages, economic growth has been very resilient in the region, and usually, with very few exceptions, economies bounce back within a year or 2 after a shock. Even the sectors that are most affected, like agriculture and tourism, usually bounce back relatively quickly. And that's because many buffering mechanisms are in place. For example, people receive remittances that tend to increase after disasters and that are coming from the large diaspora who lives outside of the region. And then governments receive external assistance and aid after disasters. But the governments and firms also have built mechanisms in order to cope with the shocks. For example, we carried out a firm survey in the tourism industry in the region, and we found that 97% of firms that we've surveyed have taken some preparedness actions against disasters. For example, they've invested in backup infrastructure, or they have business continuity plans in place. We also found that governments and regional organizations are well prepared to deal with large shocks. And we've seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen quick and efficient response from national governments in collaboration with regional and international bodies to limit the health crisis and the food security crisis. Actually, COVID cases in the Caribbean were lower in 2020 than in the rest of the Latin America region. We've also seen an expansion of cash transfer programs by governments in order to support the economy and the population during this crisis. Now, despite all of this, there are still 1 in 5 people who lives in poverty in the Caribbean region. And in every country for which we have data, we found that poor people are more exposed to natural disasters than the rest of the population, which means that these natural shocks are going to keep people in poverty. In addition, we also find that human capital is strongly affected by disasters, especially because of the school closures that happen after large disasters or during the pandemic, during which poor households in particular do not have access to remote learning because they don't have the resources to access it. Disasters also impacts people's health, not only directly, but because disasters tend to divert health resources away from the traditional health services, for example, for chronic diseases. And then finally, there are high immigration rates in the Caribbean, especially for the most educated people, and these immigration increases also after shocks. So in the long run, disasters are affecting the human capital of the region, and this could have a negative impact on the sustainability of economic growth. So the second finding of the report is that Caribbean countries are not well prepared for the new challenges that are brought by climate change and by the uncertainty on future tourism markets. And on this, I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning. A lot of Caribbean countries rely a lot on two sectors. One is the agriculture sector and the other one is the tourism sector. And those two sectors are particularly vulnerable to climate change. Agriculture yields will decrease because of climate change, and farmers will need to make investments in order to adapt. They will need to also adapt their farming techniques to this new climate reality. And then the tourism sector relies on a few assets like sandy beaches that are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and erosion that comes with sea level rise. So governments and private actors and the private sector will need to work together to adapt to this new reality in a context where we don't know exactly what the future of the tourism sector looks like. In addition to this, governments have currently limited capacity to spend more and to respond to future shocks because they've increased public spending to respond to the pandemic, and they have accumulated, for some of them, high levels of public debt. So in this context, we propose three main recommendations to increase the resilience of the region. And the first recommendation is to increase government efficiency, which means in a context where governments don't necessarily have the capacity or the resources to spend more on resilience, they have many options to spend better and to deliver higher levels of resilience with the same levels of resources than they have today. For example, they could improve investment management and infrastructure maintenance. The firms that we've surveyed report water outages every 9 days on average in the region. And a lot of the water that is supposed to reach customers is lost through the pipes because of a lack of maintenance. Governments can also improve their risk financing strategies to access instruments that can mobilize funding quickly after shocks without increasing public debt. But it's not sufficient to have those instruments. It's also important to have the mechanisms in place to spend this money better. And that includes having better procurement rules for emergency situations and allocating in advance additional budget for emergency health expenditures or adaptive social protection. Now, a second set of recommendation is to empower private actors. Again, if governments cannot spend much more, they can help households and the private sector make better decisions for resilience. And that includes giving them access to the financial instruments to invest, like better access to credit or better coverage and adequacy of social protection for the most vulnerable households. And it also includes giving them access to the data that they need to make better decisions. For example, better access to good quality risk data, which in the absence of land use plans or in the absence of budget to implement land use plans, can already help people make decisions on where to put their house or business in a place that might be safe in the future. And finally, because climate change is coming and is going to increase physical risk, it is important to increase spending in physical protection. And that includes strengthening critical infrastructure, investing in coastal protection, working with nature. We found in a study that we did for this report that the coastal areas that have mangroves suffer from 40% less damage during storm surges than other coastal areas. It's also important to enforce the building codes and standards and consider changing risks, including when planning to build back better, which means that it's important to think now about potentially building back in different areas after the next shock damages infrastructure that is currently at risk. And these choices to relocate infrastructure or communities slowly or after a shock cannot be made after the shock. They need to be prepared in advance. And so that's a long-term process that includes discussions between decision makers, communities, and scientists that need to start right now so that when the next shock arrive, governments are prepared and communities are prepared to potentially settle in different places. So I will stop here. And I'm happy to answer questions later during the panel, but I will turn to the panel right now. Thank you, Wislan.
Thank you very much for that, Julie. And I'm glad that you are sticking around because I'm sure that there are many questions that would arise out of what you've presented, which of course is diagnosis inclusive of known comorbidities or pre-existing conditions, and of course the prescription at the end. Well, I now want to welcome our esteemed panel to share their insights and views on how the Caribbean region can prepare for the future. So we have with us a very distinguished panel. Ambassador Małgorzata Wasilewska, who is head of the EU delegation to Barbados, the OECS, and the CARICOM CARIForum. Liz Riley, who is executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. Joseph Cox, assistant secretary general of Trade and Economic Integration at CARICOM. Amanda Charles, Sustainable Tourism Specialist with the Caribbean Tourism Organization, and Ariel Laidlow, Climate Change Youth Activist and Director of Program Development for the Commonwealth Youth Council for the Caribbean and the Americas. But we turn first to Ambassador Wasilewska. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
The EU is a key partner in all of this in terms of the strengthening of resilience to climate change and climate shocks in the region. But what do you see as the key priorities? And how has the pandemic influenced the agenda for addressing these priorities? Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Let me first welcome the distinguished panelists. It's a pleasure to be here today amongst you. And I'd like to start by saying how delighted we are to have the launch of this extremely timely and pertinent report, because it touches on the topics that are discussed every day and that trouble the region every day of our lives. In terms of our priorities for resilience, they will continue to align along past actions, perhaps most importantly around the priorities identified by our partners, because I really would like to stress that our cooperation with the host countries is a partnership, but also on the international mandate of the European Union. What does it really mean? That means that for the next 7 years, we are going to focus on various types of resilience to climate shocks according to the global priorities of the European Union and to the priorities identified by the region. So these will include such issues as physical resilience, identified as very important in the report. So that will include infrastructure, building back and forward better, and so on. Social resilience, safety nets, awareness, and community preparedness. I think the pandemic has shown us how fragile this area is. Ecosystem resilience, so actions that will target biodiversity and ecosystems conservation and protection. We know that ecosystems are the main richness of this region, and with such reliance on tourism, if the ecosystems are not protected, this will start impacting tourism very seriously. Financial resilience, including support to insurance. As you may know, we support CRIF and access to finance for public sector as well as private sector grants, loans, blended finance, and guarantees. And last but not least, we will support and encourage the global partnership under the Paris Agreement. You know how committed European Union is to this agreement, and that we need to keep climate on the right path for 1.5 degrees, because as Prime Minister Motley so eloquently stated at the opening of the COP26 conference, if we do not keep the 1.5 path, many of the countries, not only in this region, but many of the areas of the well-developed and wealthy countries will simply disappear. In terms of the impact of the pandemic, it has changed a lot in our lives and our way of working. It has shown incredible vulnerabilities in the systems as they existed so far. So it's clear that it's not enough to talk about shocks and risks only in terms of natural disasters, because the pandemic has shown, for example, incredible weaknesses in the health systems. The capacities of the health system in the region have been stretched and cracked beyond what anybody could have expected. But the pandemic has not changed our priorities. So the only thing that has changed is that as European Union, we will push stronger for a green transition and green recovery from the pandemic. You may know that that's our priority for ourselves, and it will be priority in our partnerships. So to put it in simple words, we both need to concentrate on our priorities and on recovery. So combining both and finding solutions that will not only bring back economic stability, economic growth to the same levels as before the pandemic or higher, hopefully higher, but that are also sustainable and greener than the old practices. I think that's the only way forward, and we stand by these priorities very strongly. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. I want to come back a little later, perhaps to pose a question to you regarding the governance arrangements that would be required to impact some of these things. You speak, for example, about the green transition, but part of the green transition, one of the issues or challenges is that the transition needs to be just. So a lot of advocates are speaking about a just transition. So we'll come back to that, but for the time being, I want to turn to Liz Riley of CDEMA now. Now, bearing in mind what you've just heard, Liz, and knowing that CDEMA has been on the front lines as a coordinating agency in the Caribbean for the past 20 years in terms of managing, mitigating risk, and so on, and considering our small size alongside the huge challenges we face, which are all well known to all of us, how do you see regional collaboration? And is there a role for new technologies in terms of effectively strengthening resilience in the region? Liz Riley.
Thank you very much, Wesley, and good morning to my fellow panelists and also to the viewers. First, I want to say a warm congratulations to the World Bank on today's launch and for the timely publication of this report. I also want to thank the World Bank team for inviting CDEMA to have the opportunity to review and comment on the report during its progress, and also for this opportunity today to participate in the launch. So in treating the question that was posed, let me start by stating that when we speak to small size, what we're really very squarely zeroing in on is the inherent characteristics of small island developing states, or SIDS. And certainly all 20 of the CDEMA participating states are SIDS. And we also know that SIDS have very unique characteristics, which contribute to their vulnerability to external shocks, and that disasters, which are caused by hazards, whether those hazards are natural, man-made, or biological in nature, are just one type of the external shock that our states will face. We also are very aware that our region is one of the most vulnerable to natural hazards. From the hydrometeorological side, we know these are exacerbated by climate change. We have specific complexities with respect to what we see happening and the changes that we're seeing happening with respect to the hazards in our geographical space, where we're having hazards occurring concurrently cascading and compounding and really resulting in systemic risk that we have to address across the region. We're also seeing hazards across different timescales, as we've seen with COVID-19, which has certainly proceeded for a protracted period. So SIDS are also characterized by having limited capacity, and therefore in the context of SIDS, this is how I want to treat with the question that you've raised with me, because what we're discussing when we're talking about resilience building is that these issues are really superimposed upon the reality of pre-existing vulnerabilities in these states. So I really want to just speak to 3 points in the response. I think from this lens of regional collaboration, it is absolutely essential in reaching agreement on the articulation of a common strategic direction for addressing common problems and really answering the question within the context of the Caribbean states of what does resilience look like. And we've done some work on this. And under the resilience framework, which was endorsed by heads of government in 2018, we identified and agreed to 5 interrelated resilience pillars, which speak to social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable. We've touched on safeguarding infrastructure, the enhancing economic activities and opportunities, environmental protection, and of course, the areas of operational readiness and recovery. And I think that one of the correlations we can make with respect to the findings of the report is that in the review, what we found is that these pillars are very well reflected within the World Bank report. And I was particularly pleased to see in one of the main findings, the whole highlighting of the social protection and really making sure that the issue of inclusivity was addressed. The second point I want to touch on brings together the 2 areas of the regional collaboration and the ICT. So specifically in strengthening our understanding of risk and reducing future risk. And these were clear messages also coming through within the report. So we know that there are certain interventions which we have started and which need to be continued and also made more robust. Interventions such as downscaling of climate models, also generating modeling related to some of the severe weather events, cyclonic activity that we have been seeing, and bringing it really to a level of granularity which makes sense and can inform decision-making from the perspective of not only disaster managers, but also actors at the national level. And we've done a lot of investment already in our regional centers of excellence. And I think this is something that has to be continued because practically, we know that individual states within the region will not be able to reach that level of capacity to deliver the type of scientific knowledge and making the connections between the scientific knowledge and the practice within their own geographical spaces. So I think the regional collaboration really is critical to bring to bear on this better understanding of the risk as we go forward. And there's also a very important space here for leveraging technology. And already we have seen both at the regional level and at the national level where entities are committed now to digital transformation, really trying to understand how better to utilize the technology to transform the way in which we are undertaking the work that we have to do. And this includes, for example, better application of geospatial technologies, geographical information systems, remotely sensed information to support the understanding of the complexity that's associated with risks which are systemic. And my final point is related to the benefits of regional collaboration as it relates to supporting representation, negotiation, conduits for resource delivery to the region, and implementation. And I know that's quite a mouthful there. And to demonstrate this, it is best to zero in on some of the findings of the State of the Caribbean Climate Report, which was done in 2020. And we know we've just come off the the heels of COP26. And we know that within our region that all of our climate parameters are changing. We know also that our climate impacts are increasing, but also is loss and damage. And I know that this was a very critical area put on the table by the small island states at COP26. We also recognize that within the context of the CDEMA participating states, for sure, this issue of graduation from eligibility to be able to access certain types of financial resources is a bugbearer, I would say, across our states. And I can say the last time all of our CDEMA states, at the time it was 16, appeared on the OECD list of eligible states was in 2003 to 2004. And now in 2021, 11 out of our 20 states appear. And what we have been seeing is that more and more, the principles of differentiation have been permeating into the discussions that we as a regional organization have with our development partners. And this, we think, is really undermining the principle of a one CDEMA system. And I think very well reflected in the report is that it states that countries of the region are really not prepared for the new challenges posed by climate change. And it also very importantly highlights that lack of the fiscal space. And this is why the regional collaboration around the issue of resource mobilization and representation to ensure that the resource mobilization is adequate and timely is a very critical one. So I'm looking forward to the panel discussion and to any questions which may come forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Liz. Quite provocative, because one of the things that it invokes is this whole question of fine-tuning the level of regional collaboration. So that sort of flows very smoothly into the question I have for ASG Joseph Cox of the CARICOM Secretariat. You know, what do you see, Joseph, as the key gaps regional partnerships can help fill? What has worked well? And perhaps you might want to mention what has not worked very well. And what do you see as the best ways to strengthen resilience in the region? Joseph Cox, CARICOM.
All right. Thank you very much, Wesley, and good morning to my fellow panelists. And also allow me to add my word of congratulations to the World Bank in the launch of this publication. Now, Wesley, you raise a couple of very interesting points, because the thing is simple as let me work with a simple premise that I use to preface any such remarks that I make on these issues. And it's as simple as this. Individually, we may go fast. Collectively, we will go far. Now, when I say that, what are some of the issues that we have been looking at as a region to treat with some of the challenges we have in terms of ensuring the longer term, medium to long term resilience of our economies? Because let's make very clear. In terms of the issues of climate change, there is so much that we can do and no more. 1.5 degrees, what was it? 1.5 to stay alive. It's not a slogan. It's a reality that faces a lot of countries where they're faced with an existential crisis. So it's not just a matter of raising it and saying, okay, well, the countries need to be more resilient, because to be truthful, if what is going on in terms of the warming, the global warming of our planet, if it continues, a lot of the countries, they might be severely compromised. So we need to look at it very clearly. But when we look at it from the CARICOM standpoint, one of the things that we're looking at, we have to look at it within the context of what are our existent realities. And yes, the report does, at least in the presentation this morning, references, of course, made to the high levels of indebtedness, the fiscal constraints that have been placed on the countries, and the reality that when we are looking at it, we are looking at, for example, and let's get down to practicalities. We're looking at hurricane damage and hurricane impacts on countries. Some of the countries that are very, very small. And the plain truth of it, a glancing blow usually means the coverage of the entire country. That's why you can have these substantial amounts of damage being recorded within a limited time span. But as we saying all of that, we have to look on what are the issues that we have been looking at. We've been looking at economic resilience, and that would include things like access to finance solutions. In fact, right now, we are heavily involved and far along the way in terms of dealing with things like credit reporting, deposit insurance, a consumer protection diagnostic that is underway. These are some of the issues that you're bringing to bear. But then while we are looking at broadening and strengthening the financial infrastructure and economic infrastructure, we also have to take into consideration the efforts that we are also making at the same time in terms of energy transformation, and as Liz just quite rightly pointed out, digital transformation. Again, a lot of work has been done in those areas. But as we have seen coming out of the pandemic, one of the realities is this, and we have said this repeatedly, in the initial stages of the pandemic, for example, there was a shift, a real shift, a substantial shift to electronic commerce. But what were the principal, or who were the principal beneficiaries of that move to electronic commerce? It came out of United States, United Kingdom, Japan, etc. Why? Because we are still constrained in terms of, one, the effective digital penetration within the economies, because a survey was done by MasterCard last year, 2020, sometime in 2020, which pointed to the fact that in most of our countries, particularly rural population, we are speaking about between 50 to 70, 80% with minimal access to in terms of the infrastructure. So we recognize that. There is also an area whereby, and Wesley, I don't like to speak without putting a solution on the table. We also have to look at it from the perspective of the Secretariat and the wider community is now pushing electronic commerce. However, one of the things that we have to take into consideration while we look at that framework is how do we treat the issue of the fees that are associated, for example, with electronic transactions, because we have to reduce the transactions cost to wean people from going from the straight cash economy or cash outlook. So what we're looking at, you look at the EU, and my good friend, ambassador in Barbados can appreciate this point more so than most, I suspect. In the EU, you have the interchange fees that are charged applied to credit cards and debit cards ranging between 0.2 and 0.3%. In the region, our merchant discount rate, which includes the fees attached, associated with the credit cards and debit cards and so on, per transaction is 2 to 4%. In other words, the fee structure is too high, and those are some of the issues that we have to grapple with as we start to move through this continuum. Because the truth be spoken is, as we look at where we're going in terms of it, and I appreciate the points that have been made in the report. But one thing I would say to them, to my friends here at the World Bank, is that you say 360-degree resilience, but I would say to you probably have spoken about 180 degrees. Why? For the simple reason that it seems to me that when we're looking at the dynamic, no, this is not just a matter of hurricanes. Frankly speaking, we used to hear about the hurricanes or some of these major hurricanes, the 150 mile per hour wind thing, as once in a century. These things now with climate change and so on, trust me, it's far more frequent than 100 years. But the fact of life is that it takes time for the economies to transition. It's not just a simple matter of wishing that it will happen, and it will happen. But we have to take into consideration that, for example, part of the resilience challenge that the countries face is that when they, for example, go through a substantial natural disaster, part of the challenge in the recovery has been their effective access to affordable financing. Because based on the dynamics and the other fiscal challenges that they have, they have to also be mindful of what they can take on board. And these are some of the other challenges that have to be brought to bear while we look on in the equation. But
Joseph, I'm sure that Julie will perhaps the report does take note of some of these global asymmetries with which the region has to grapple. But I want to move on to Amanda. But before I do, just a very quick word, because in your portfolio, you have agriculture, food production. There's a very real concern, particularly now in the pandemic era, that food and nutrition security ought to be far more front and center of some of the things we're dealing with. I wonder if you can quickly address that. I will move on. We could come back to some of the other points.
Sure, that's very simple. In terms of where we are now, the heads of government have approved the COVID-19 agro-food plan, and that is, and also the attendance strategy to deal with the agro-food systems. We have been working extremely closely with our private sector counterparts, and indeed, without taking any tails out of school, they have gone as far as to basically quantify the levels of investment, which are substantial, that the private sector is willing and able to put into the sector, because the point is well taken. Food security and food and nutrition security is a matter that is not just for the region, but frankly speaking, the whole world, because there is a caloric deficiency that faces the world that, frankly speaking, no country can ignore us. But what we're looking at is where we are now, taking into consideration the supply chain disruptions and all the other challenges that have been brought to bear. And one last thing, Wesley, I want to just throw in for good measure on the agriculture, is that we have also had a facility established by agreement of our Council for Trade and Economic Development, a cross-border facility, a cross-border training to allow for agriculture extension officers. So in other words, we're creating an infrastructure that allows for cross-border training and the real knowledge building across the sector.
Thank you very much, ASG Joseph Cox. Now, Amanda Charles, CTO, a lot of what the ASG just said there dovetails into several concerns of the Caribbean Tourism Organization and the industry generally. Now, one of the things that the report does is it highlights the significant impacts of climate change on the tourism sector. The challenges have been exacerbated by the pandemic, of course, and you can address that, even as it is highly sensitive to global economic fluctuations. How is the sector positioning itself to meet these challenges? And what do you see as the role of regional governments and development partners in meeting the demands of a more resilient future for what is indeed a key sector in the Caribbean?
Thank you very much. And I join my fellow panelists in extending thanks to the World Bank and its partners for extending an invitation to the Caribbean Tourism Organization to participate in this important dialogue. So I would like to, start my contribution to the discussion by reiterating the importance of tourism to the Caribbean. As we know, the region is the most tourism dependent in the world. And, as one of the primary drivers of social and economic development, tourism, as at 2019, accounted for 41.1% of GDP, 17% employment, with an estimated 2.8 million workers directly employed in the sector. And what we saw with the advent of COVID-19 was that after decades of successive growth, tourism arrivals and receipts fell sharply in the wake of country lockdowns, travel restrictions worldwide. And as a result, tourism contracted by 65.5% when compared to 2019. We received in 2020 just over 11 million visitors, corresponding to tourism arrivals last attained in 1988. So in terms of the response and recovery strategy in what has been deemed the new normal, certainly the regional vision for the future of Caribbean tourism is one that is sustainable, viable, of high quality, one that is climate smart, certainly resilient, and promotes local empowerment and inclusiveness. We strongly believe that the future sustainability and growth of Caribbean tourism, it must be informed by partnerships, both as it relates to the public sector, the private sector, and indeed international development partners, prioritize issues related to enhancing local and regional intersectoral linkages, certainly digital transformation, which Liz Riley made mention of, environmental sustainability, and certainly the blue economy. We are very reliant on the marine resource for both food security, for attractions related to the tourism sector, and generally health and wellness as it relates to the regional lifestyle. So certainly resilience building and low carbon transition are essential strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change, and also the multi-hazard context in which the region finds itself, and by extension, the tourism sector. So as it relates to the positioning of Caribbean tourism, response and recovery strategies have required a multiple-pronged approach. At the sector level, several countries have launched skills training programs for displaced tourism workers, specifically targeting micro, small, and medium enterprises, vulnerable groups as well, including women, the youth, and indigenous communities. And we've had innovations such as remote working visas, which have allowed the region to be competitive in the market for digital nomads. We've also seen the advent of travel bubbles and staycation packages, which are incentives targeted to stimulate domestic tourism, as well as inter and intra-regional travel. At the regional level, the Caribbean, in fact, CTO and its partners, including CARICOM, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, among others, we have upscaled the Regional Tourism and Health Program, which was launched in 2014. So we were very proactive in terms of having a system for collaboration in place prior to the pandemic. And through this task force, we have developed a number of health protocols, safety guidelines, and this essentially provides a platform for ongoing collaboration as it relates to tourism resilience broadly. I also would like to highlight that in 2020, CTO produced an updated Caribbean Sustainable Tourism Policy and Development Framework. This is aligned to the region's attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We also produced a multi-hazard risk management guide for the Caribbean tourism sector. This was supported by SEDIMA and other regional partners, and the guide provides specific mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery strategies, as well as actions to reduce disaster risk, and it is complemented with how-to guides and templates that can be used by tourism stakeholders at both the country as well as individual tourism business levels. So in terms of the continued role of regional governments and development partners, we believe that it is important to implement strategies to instill both local community and visitor confidence. And that is needed to guarantee a safe but also welcoming environment. Equally important in the thrust to recovery is the opportunity to generate more tangible and direct local benefits from tourism, and that would be for local communities. The region certainly would benefit from the continued partnership and technical assistance that can be generated by our regional and international development partners. And one of the key areas should be capacity building of regional institutions, such as the CTO, CDIMA, CIMH, and others that we work closely with. And the work then would be aligned to strategic priorities for economic diversification and resilience building. So as I wrap up my comments, I would like to share with certainly the panel and the participants that health safety, climate, and disaster resilience have been identified as among the critical issues to be addressed for the sustainability of tourism. Addressing these issues have several policy and development implications which deal with the level of risk and exposure of the tourism sector, including its image, certainly information management, and the need to enforce standards, adopt measures and protocol to improve levels of safety and security across the tourism value chain to natural and anthropogenic crisis and disasters. So as we look towards the future, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Caribbean governments have taken impressive action to cushion the blow of tourism, and that includes the preparation of tourism recovery plans. It is important, however, that regional governments implement these plans. This is often the deficit that we notice. It is also important to engage in a continuous process of monitoring and evaluation, working in tandem with our regional and development partners. And this holistic strategy, we believe, is critical to both spur and sustain recovery across the tourism value chain. So it's a mouthful, and I'm happy to delve deeper into some more strategic recommendations that in terms of further contributing to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Amanda. Charles of the CTO, we'll certainly come back to take you up on some of the points you've made, because certainly at a sectoral level, many pre-pandemic blueprints that were being developed and designed have now been put on scramble and reorientation and all of that. So I'll come back to that in a little while, but I want to bring Aria in here because she's our youth representative now, and this is where we focus on the future. How do you, Aria, view current attempts by governments to build resilience through interventions that can create jobs and economic opportunity? What do we do as countries, nations, to keep our young people in the region? Julie's presentation focused a little bit on that, and we want to come back to that as well. What do we do to keep our young people in the region at home, playing a role in the development process? Aria Laidlow, that big question is for you.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And I must say it indeed is a pleasure to be here this morning on such a distinguished panel, really discussing issues that are so pertinent to our future development. And more importantly, as a young woman from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and as you know, we had an unprecedented year this year, from the volcanic eruptions to COVID-19 to a severe strain of dengue fever. We have had it all. So we really sit in a very unique position. What I must say in terms of generating jobs and creating a way forward for youth in the future and in terms of resilience, we have to first start at the foundation in terms of education. I think it is imperative for Caribbean governments to understand, and also as someone who works within the education field, that we need to pivot away from the way how we structure our curriculums, how we structure our classes, and the sort of correct guidance that we are giving our young people for the future. We saw that COVID-19 has really shackled things as it pertains to our normal for education within the region, Persons had to go to remote learning. And as you know, for most countries, we're more face-to-face every day. What persons like to say, chalk and talk, right? And this meant that persons had to have access to devices and also access to internet. And more importantly, it also meant that educators themselves had to be well-versed in ICT, and we found great challenges there. So even though pre-COVID, governments have discussed about integrating ICT within our education system, COVID-19 really challenged us and taught us and showed us the way in which we really need to go. And this is why I said that it is important for us to look at this fair as a sort of window of opportunity, despite the many economic and social devastation that our countries have experienced. There are many opportunities here. And I think integrating ICT within our education system and developing the career paths of our young people to move forward is very important. I think also that governments need to be very wary of wanting to create this normalcy, this notion that things would go back to where they used to be, especially for our young people. I often tell my students, because I'm a lecturer at the SVGCC, that I know you don't like remote learning, but there are opportunities to be gained by being able to work from home within the future, because the world is simply not going to go back to what we used to know it as. So I think it is important for governments to also start that conversation as to how we can really pivot our education system to really integrate ICT and really guide our youth towards the future. Second point that we need to also consider is the transformation of our industries, tourism and agriculture, in which we're so very dependent on, but as we can see, very vulnerable. Are we still going to go with the notion that we're depending on our sand, sunshine, and white sandy shores to be able to prompt our tourism product? We need to start thinking about different ways. And I think Amanda mentioned about integrating technology more into tourism. And I think the UNDP had discussions about possibly integrating virtual reality as Caribbean countries being able to sell their tourism product to persons away who simply don't want to travel again, who might be just scared to go on a cruise or, pay for a plane ticket, knowing that COVID-19 is still amongst us today. So looking at ways in which you can create jobs within those avenues as well is very important. Because I must say, if we're serious about resilience and if we're talking about climate change, we cannot welcome continued development along our coastline. So governments are being watched as well to see how serious you are about this. We cannot continue to praise large commercial hotel chains which are solely focused on importing goods and services and not really purchasing from our small local farmers and local businesses. So these are things that we really need to take into consideration when talking about transforming our industries. When we're looking at agriculture as well, now we need to look at how we can create crops to be more resilient when you're looking at climate change in the future. And also the eruption of Lassa has brought in a different concept now. How do we bounce back and how do farmers become more resilient after the eruptions? Many of them were unable to return to their fields. And, how do we set up a system to ensure our food security into the future? And these are avenues that young people can be channeled as well, creating those alternatives. And next point I want to touch on as well is entrepreneurship. It is impossible for governments due to our small scale to create jobs for everybody, right? And I think young people are really geared and really conscious about entrepreneurship and being able to really make that dollar for themselves. Now, on the macro scale, we often speak about countries not being able to access funding for projects. But what about young people, right? It's very difficult for a young person to access funding from banks and even to be able to open an account in itself. So it is very important that governments find ways to be able to stem that train of entrepreneurship, that drive that I think that is within young people. But we need as governments to facilitate that process, to provide the gateways, the opportunities, and the vehicles to which young people can really drive themselves in a way that is sustainable for them within the future. Another point I also want to raise is that the Caribbean itself has current institutional capacities that can help drive us. You have the CARICOM Single Market and Economy and the OECS. And one of the cornerstones of these organizations is the free movement of our people. I think this is something that we can really continue to capitalize on. And although there have been some successes, there have been challenges and barriers. I think it is important that if our highly skilled and highly trained and highly educated people would like to go to our neighboring countries, that it should be done in a way that is not hassling at all. But also we need to talk about things such as the ease in which persons are able to do that. We saw the collapse of LIAT. So regional travel and prices to be able to buy your plane tickets to go, and the ease in which persons can transition and live within our countries. We need to think about how we can break down some of those barriers. Lastly, I want to state is that, you know, emigration and persons moving out of the region is not going to end. It's not going to stop. It is something that is going to persist until the end of time, I think. But I think what is very important is how do we keep our diaspora home, right? The Honorable Keith Mitchell, during the last spike in Grenada in COVID-19, he pleaded with nurses and doctors to come home to Grenada, we need you. How do we keep our diaspora in touch with home? How do we keep track of our highly skilled and highly educated people? They go away and that's it. Can we create platforms where persons can meet, persons can network in different specialty areas? And what sort of benefits maybe governments can have for persons who are highly skilled within the diaspora to keep them in tune in with home, right? So I think those are some things that our governments need to consider, which are quite just a few little tidbits in ways in which we can really generate the jobs that we need for tomorrow, but also how can we keep our people within the region? And I just would like to say that as going forward, and I you know, this report is so important that we understand that when our policymakers and administrators look at the blueprints pre-COVID and after COVID, they should be different. I know it's so contradictory because sometimes you are part of these panel discussions and a lot of the things that have been said before, and that's facts. So I think really intentional implementation and actor-driven strategies going forward is very important. And the discussions must be had at the national and local level. So that means if you're creating strategies for young people, we want to be a part of that discussion. And I know persons often say young people can take the seat at the table, and that is true. But sometimes you take the seat and then you're still there listening. So intentional engagement with our actors and our stakeholders from our vulnerable populations as well, it is so important. And I just want to leave us with this tidbit within this, this reality and this context for young people. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in the indigenous communities in North Windward side of the island, on a poverty assessment, they are the most poor and impoverished portions of our population. They were also affected by the last fire eruptions. And over the years, they have had the most devastations as it relates to the passing of tropical storms, including Tropical Storm Thomas, right? And these young people have been displaced. So when we're thinking about creating strategies and creating opportunities for young people going forward, we need to think about the intersectionality of these problems affecting young people. So I just want to end there and then we can have further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. But by no means little tidbits, that's a full manifesto for regional development that you have outlined there. I want to thank you very much. One of the subjects that you raised, and it's expressed in a concern in the chat by Johannes, has to do with agriculture, food production, food and nutrition security, which was an issue that Joseph Cox raised. And we have Lilia Barunchik, who has an interest in responding to that concern. And you mentioned it, Aria and Amanda, it forms part of what you spoke about, because Johannes's concern is that while we speak about tourism, and we talk about food production, and might I add, we talk about entrepreneurship, and we talk about economic resilience, sometimes these connections are not made. So Lilia, what would be your contribution to that concern?
Yeah, thank you, Wesley. It was actually fascinating to listen to the points of view expressed here. And on agriculture, I started working on the Caribbean very recently, and I visited a few countries, and I actually make a point of trying the local produce in each of the countries. And let me tell you, the quality is amazing, very tasty. And then when I stay at these hotels, and they serve different, fruits and vegetables, they're so tasteless because they're imported. And the question comes to mind, why? I think there is a huge potential for developing the local agriculture industry and making sure that the agriculture products are supplied to the hotels and are exported, because I think there is huge export potential. One thing that we need to keep in mind is that providing produce to the hotels is more or less the same as exporting. So it's the same set of standards, because the hotels have very high standards. They are the level of international standards. So if you get ready for providing produce year-round, same quality, meeting all the food safety standards to the hotels, then it means you may be actually ready to export externally to the world markets as well. One thing that is very important here is the volume. And here where regional cooperation comes to play. First of all, not all islands have the same potential in terms of producing agriculture products. Some have more potential and in different, maybe sometimes crops. But the volume is the issue, and it's so important to create a single market and to create regional value chains, because this is where the potential is, and to improve trade facilitation. And we mentioned during the discussion the issue of free movement of people. I think we should also look very seriously at the free movement of goods. I think Joseph mentioned that very, clearly in his presentation, but I see a lot of potential. And I think what is important is for the countries in the region to get their act together and work regionally on resolving these barriers, because the potential is definitely there. Thank you.
Thanks for that intervention, Lilia Burenchuk, who is the new World Bank Country Director. Amanda, what's up with this apparent failure to make this critical link between food production in the Caribbean and the tourism sector?
So thank you again for that question. And I know that it was raised certainly by Lilia and Aria. Well, we have made a lot of strides, significant strides. And, I would have mentioned in my remarks the importance of intersectoral linkages. So currently, CTO has a very close relationship with ECA. We also collaborate with CARDI and are looking at how we can facilitate information flows between the farmers, the fishermen, the suppliers, and the tourism sector. So the difficulty has been the lack of information on availability, obviously consistency related to the standard, consistency related to the supply, and that is also impacted by climate change. If you have drought conditions and other factors that can impact agricultural production. So certainly I believe CARICOM, in collaboration with CTO and other partners, are engaged in a comprehensive approach to strengthen the agriculture sector, to be able to supply certainly the local and regional market and provide those necessary inputs to the tourism sector that will allow us then to have a more reliable source of local produce and so reduce the heavy dependence on imports. So certainly that is ongoing, and it has been identified as a priority.
Joseph Cox of CARICOM, I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard this. Issues of quality, issues of reliability of supply. To what extent is the region looking at that issue? Those issues.
No, well, remember, as I said in my presentation, that there was a regional food and nutrition plan and strategy that had been put on the table. And these are exactly some of the issues that have been treated with under that program. But one of the things that I wanted to raise in response to this issue as well is, and this is more directed to my friends at the World Bank, because I happen to be a full-throated proponent of a concept introduced to me years ago by the World Bank, known as anchor farms. And this is where I see the solution coming, whereby what we're talking about is that we sort out, because part of the challenge that we have in the agricultural sector across the region is this kind of boom and bust thing. Information flow is a challenge, yes, but what you have is a scenario whereby persons, they either produce in a glut and everybody trends towards a particular market at one point and that depresses prices and then they shift to another. So the hotels will complain about inconsistency in supply, sometimes quality, etc. When you use an anchor farm concept, you're talking about a large farm who basically have a number of satellite farmers who are, when producing to quality and to scale, you have a guaranteed market, and therefore you can start to treat with some of the supply inadequacies that's currently faced. So that is something that we really do pride, and I would encourage persons to do it. And it is covered. That sort of concept is covered in the nutrition plan that has been approved by the heads of government. But also, Wesley, I think it is important for us to recognize that we can't, as a region, we can't do it alone. Let's make it very clear. We need partnerships. And this is where I see a golden opportunity for institutions like the World Bank to recognize and inculcate the concepts and the precepts of our regional integration strategy into the country programs that they have, because that would strengthen it. Everybody recognizes collaboration is the way to go. Regional integration is the way to go. So therefore, let's strengthen it. So by making sure that the programs that are being proposed by the bank and by other institutions are also congruent with what we are trying to push through under the notion of regional integration.
You know, Julie, Joseph has thrown quite a big ball on your side of the court. There's a few other concerns that have come from the floor. One has to do with what you really mean by cross-cutting resilience. And also there's a concern about inclusivity in that. In your presentation, you mentioned the poor, but are there other marginalized groups that you would need to speak to? And I'm sure that in the report there is abundant mention of that. But perhaps you can take up Joseph's question, and then go into the issue of cross-cutting resilience.
Yes, of course. So on the issue of inclusivity, that's correct. I mentioned poor people, but we're looking more broadly at vulnerable groups and who's most impacted by disasters, what are their characteristics, and how should they be supported in general, including in particular by social protection. And on this, we have a full background paper on the adequacy and coverage of social protection instruments in the region. So there's a lot of information on this. Now, on what we mean by cross-cutting resilience, that's a good question. So our traffic light system is organized in 6 pillars. One of them is what we call foundations, which is really not the things that you would do for resilience, but that are necessary no matter what. And that includes inclusive growth, access to basic services, basically the development outcomes you need first in order to then be able to build resilience. And then we have a pillar on basically helping households and the private sector reduce their exposure and vulnerability to risks. And that also includes social transfers, access to credit, financial inclusion. We have another one on protecting public assets and services. So that includes infrastructure, health and education services. Then we have another one on being prepared to deal with the shocks that cannot be avoided, because even though a lot can be done on adaptation and reducing vulnerability to shocks, we know there will be shocks in the future. And so it's improved preparedness, adaptive social protection, insurance, being prepared to build back better, etc. And then the final pillar is on the macro fiscal resilience and making sure that at the macro level, the government is prepared and has the instruments to quickly respond after a shock and do the spending that's necessary. So that's a long list of what we mean by cross-cutting resilience.
But I think that the proof in the pudding will be in the eating, and the document together with the research documents, which are very sectorally laid out and a very, very interesting reading. There's another concern from Johannes, and he says, who's a member of the floor, we need to figure out how to provide the Caribbean countries with a sufficient and sustained amount of finance required for the investments that these states need to become more resilient to natural disasters. In the Netherlands, this is currently the subject of a lively debate. Considerable investments are needed to reinforce our dike system, etc. But the fact of the matter is that Johannes' concern speaks to the whole question of allocating resources, which are, of course, are not only financial in nature, because you need the expertise and you need a certain level of infrastructure. Julie, coming back to you again, how would you respond to that particular concern? It was raised earlier by Liz, I know, in her presentation, and also by Amanda.
Yes, well, so in the report and from my perspective, I cannot talk much about how to increase financing and resources for Caribbean countries. But what I can say is that throughout our analysis, we have identified a lot of efficiencies, right? And that's one of our main messages, that even with the resources that are available today, much more can be done to be more resilient. So I would put that as a priority. And then maybe I would ask Lilia, I don't know, to answer on how to increase the amount of resources. But in general, I think so much more can be done just by spending better with what's available today.
Okay, so we want to bring Lilia on at the very end. So perhaps you park that question for a response. I have a final one from a journalist from Jamaica. How best can the Caribbean make environmental protection and ecology a part of national development strategy, given that many countries are dependent on tourism and agriculture? Joseph, you want to have a quick go at that? This is going to be the last question before we turn to Lilia to wrap up.
Can you just repeat the question? Because how can we?
I think the question basically has to do with how do we integrate these concerns about the climate crisis, about what's happening in the natural.
Oh, okay, yeah. What? Yeah, but by basically putting in place the requisite regulatory framework throughout the countries. I mean, in most, if not all countries, they would have at least a national development plan. And one would hope that they would have some agency that's responsible for national environmental protection, that they would have those resources, the requisite resources to govern those things. So in other words, people don't just go and build willy-nilly. I mean, we know across the region we have people who are involved in living in marginal housing, people building, by the gully banks and river banks and so on, really unsafe things. But it really does come down to the question of the policing, putting in place a requisite environmental framework and the policing of such a framework, because that has been a contentious issue across many islands, and I suspect it will be an issue for years to come.
Very much, Joseph. Liz, you have 30 seconds to respond to this. Having the regulations, and at the SEDEMA level, you can have all the regulations, and you can speak until you're red in the face about implementation, but yet there's this roadblock when it comes to people taking action in compliance with regulations. You have 30 seconds, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of the people taking action, the whole issue of behavioral science is one that I think has really come to the fore, not just in the larger hydrometeorological events in the region, but also during COVID, because we have these assumptions that we made with respect to will behave, guidance that is given to persons or opportunities given to persons, and that is bear true. I think at the root of that is related to I also think that we have to look very carefully at how we're handling our messaging. And certainly from the perspective, one of the things I'm talking about, how do you move people to act, is really about better visualization of the potential impacts. And that could generate some level of, I think it is an area that is wide open for the research and exploration.
Thank you very much for that, Liz. And now we have to wrap, and I want to invite Ms. Lilia Burunchuk, who is a new World Bank Country Director, as I said before, and who I understand is soon moving to Kingston to open the bank's new regional office there. Lilia, you have the floor.
I already moved to Kingston, by the way.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you for this really interesting and fascinating discussion. And it's a discussion that is to be continued because there are so many issues that we can actually work on together and implement. Just going back to the main conclusions of the report that we discussed today, and the first one, increase the efficiency of the resources, because if you increase the efficiency of the resources that are available today, there will be more resources coming. If the world and development partners can see that the Caribbean can actually put these resources to good use. One thing that we are seeing today is, by the way, we already increased our resources to the Caribbean quite significantly, including the concessional resources to countries that are eligible for IDA, the International Development Agency concessional resources, would triple this amount. And what we actually see is that the capacity to absorb these resources in the region is limited. So we need to make sure that there is capacity to absorb and to make sure that all these projects that are being put in place and the activities that are being put in place are actually moving. Now, in terms of increasing efficiency, one thing that was mentioned by Julia, but I would like to highlight as well, is procurement, because a lot can be saved by doing procurement transparently, by doing procurement competitively. And there are many other ways prioritizing and making sure that the resources actually put into the most important activities that will produce the best results. And another point, another conclusion of the report and made by Julia, very important, is attract the private sector, because no matter how many resources the public sector will have and how many resources will come from the World Bank, and you have the commitment of the World Bank to continue supporting the region to the maximum and full extent, and raising whatever resources we can raise together with other development partners. No matter how much of these resources will be put in place, I think this will be far from being enough. And we need to make sure that we create an environment that the private sector can come and invest. This is where really the biggest bulk of resources will come from. A few additional points. First, on regional cooperation, we discussed it a little bit today. It's so critical for the region. And I really think that if we want to see the region 10 years down the road, not continuing to deal with the same issues as it is dealing today and has been dealing in the past, it needs to get its act together on regional cooperation in many areas, in tourism, we discussed agriculture, trade, but there are many other areas, innovation, digital area. There are many other areas where the region will benefit significantly if regional cooperation is improved. And I see quite a lot of work ahead of all of us, and in particular CARICOM and partnering with CARICOM in this area. By the way, in terms of the efficiency of resources, I want to bring one area on the table, and this is energy. energy is so expensive in the Caribbean. It's the issue of competitiveness. It's the issue of affordability for the private sector and others, for the households and so on. Here is one of the long-hanging fruit, I think, moving to renewable energy and lowering the cost of energy. And the final point I would like to make, and I know we are out of time already, is on innovation. I was really impressed when I met with a few innovators when I was in St. Lucia a month ago. There is so much creativity. There is so much innovation in the Caribbean. We need to capitalize that. Youth are full of ideas. And I like the idea of the platform, and let's create some platforms and then link it to innovation and bring also the diaspora into the innovation field. I see great potential there. And I look forward to continuing our discussions on this and other areas, how we can make the Caribbean region more resilient, more prosperous, and a better place for people to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Lilia Baranchuk, who is the new World Bank Country Director. And while we've run out of time, I want to thank again the World Bank and CARICOM for hosting today's event, UETV for broadcasting it via its channels, and to the sponsors of the report, the European Union and the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction. I invite everyone to go read the report and all the ancillary literature that's together with it. I also want to thank our esteemed panel for joining today's discussion and sharing their views. Malgorzata, there were some questions for you, and I'm sorry you ran out of time and we couldn't pursue them. Elizabeth, Joseph, Amanda, and Aria, many thanks for the wonderful insights and perspectives. And of course, Felipe, Lilia, and Julie at the World Bank who are behind production of the report. Thank you very much for this. And this is the end of the event, but please follow the World Bank's social media channels and find out more about this report and all of the associated issues. I'm Wesley Gibbing saying thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of the day.